my name is Philip Heedy, and I'm the lead product manager for ArcGIS Enterprise. Today, together with my colleague, Jill Edstrom-Shoemaker, also a product manager for ArcGIS Enterprise, I'm going to talk about ArcGIS Enterprise and introduce you to the product as a developer. This is a little bit different from what we've often done for our introductory sessions. What Jill and I will cover is not just what ArcGIS Enterprise is from an end user perspective, but it will also try to give you a view into how an administrator sees the system and you as a developer, how you will see the system and be able to interact with it. To that end, we'll talk about the REST APIs that ArcGIS Enterprise provide. We'll talk about the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK and the extensibility points that it provides, things like SOEs, SOIs, and webhooks. And then to round things out, we'll talk about the higher level APIs that are available to interact with ArcGIS Enterprise. It doesn't all have to be REST APIs that you directly have to write queries against using your favorite coding tools. You can actually use these higher level APIs, such as the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, ArcGIS Runtime SDKs, and also several non-Esri and open source APIs that know how to talk to ArcGIS Enterprise and its various services. So with that, let's start with getting an overview of what ArcGIS Enterprise really is and what exactly the software is. To do that, I'll turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Philip, for the introduction. Before we get into ArcGIS Enterprise and what all you can do with the software as a developer, let's take a moment to discuss what ArcGIS Enterprise is first. What exactly is the software that we're all here?
Portal, which comes to life through the Portal for ArcGIS software component itself. And then at the end of the day, we have apps, lots and lots of apps that come with the system itself, but of course, also the many apps that you as end developers can create for your own uses. Those may be individual applications, they may be entire solutions that consist of multiple applications and potentially even have its own backend logic in addition to what comes from ArcGIS Enterprise. Those applications sit on top of REST APIs coming from the Enterprise portal, as well as those GIS services that underpin the whole system. So the REST API structure really fits into this tiered model nicely in that the information model has a REST API that informally is known as the sharing API, simply because of the path to the REST endpoint. The root of that REST API itself is found at /sharing on the Enterprise portal. The services have each their own REST APIs, whether it's a map service, a feature service, and so forth. We'll talk more about them in just a second. And they will be found on your ArcGIS server sites at /rest/services. And then finally, we've got those REST APIs for managing the individual software components. And we'll talk about those in just a second as well. So when we're looking at that top REST API, the sharing API that comes from the Enterprise portal, it's all about working with users, groups, and items. And those users, groups, and items really form the logical foundation of the system. Users and groups is, of course, what forms the foundation of the security model itself. The system already knows who is making a request. After all, you've authenticated to the system. But now, with the combination of the groups that are managed within the system, we can also make determinations of whether you have access, or rather, whether the person making the request has access to a certain piece of content or not. That's because content is either owned by you or shared with you in order for you to have access. And that, in a nutshell, is where the sharing API gets its name from. It's very much about controlling that access. And you can interact with the sharing API to share content and create new content and manipulate existing content within the system. That content comes in the form of items. Items represent pieces of information that define behavior of the applications that read those items. You can really think of them as configuration files. Now there's a lot of different item types within the ArcGIS system. There's items that represent individual web services. So you can apply configuration on top of an already published web service So for example, those map services or feature services, you can change how they're visualized by applications by configuring that item that represents the service underneath. We also have higher level items such as a web map. A web map item is really a JSON configuration file that specifies which layers to draw in a map, the order, how to draw them, and so forth. What's common to all of these different item types is that Esri has already taught our higher level APIs, like the ArcGIS API for JavaScript or ArcGIS runtime APIs that I'll talk about here in just a second. We've taught them how to read and understand these configuration files, how to read a web map item. So when the ArcGIS API for JavaScript reads a web map, it knows how to draw that. You can directly pass that to a map control within the API, and that map control will read the item, know exactly what layers to connect to, and how to draw everything without you having to hard code it inside of your application. And because every application that is created, both by Esri and by yourself, knows how to share a common set of configuration files, these items, web maps, and so forth, you can share those configurations between many different applications without having to recreate them over and over again. So at the end of the day, you'll be interacting with the sharing API when you want to interact with users, groups, and items. Users and groups if you are creating new users, groups, or editing existing groups for the purpose of sharing items there, really for interacting with the security model itself. Items you will be interacting with quite a lot, particularly if you're consuming already existing items for the purposes of, for example, drawing a map in your application, but potentially also editing existing items if you want to store new configuration options for manipulating what's already been created somehow, changing the behavior of other applications that are relying on those items. Everything there is something you can do and will be doing using the sharing API. Now, the services APIs are really where the hard work is done. These are the engines of the system. And we've got a lot of different REST-based web services. And I've mentioned some of them already. Map and feature services are really the workhorses of the system. Map services know how to draw 2D maps. Feature services is all about editing data, taking data offline for use in mobile devices, for example, and then also taking edits from those mobile devices back when the devices are back online and applying those edits. Feature services are really powerful in many ways. But we've also got geocoding services for working with addresses, network services for working with street networks. And each of these different service types have their own REST APIs that you can interact with directly. There's a lot of things to do here. So let's take a quick look at a simple example. Here we've got a map service. For any of you who've worked with ArcGIS Server before, you may be familiar with this map service. It's the sample service that comes with every ArcGIS Server site to verify that it's working properly. So sample world cities is ubiquitous across the ArcGIS Enterprise ecosystem. What you can see here is a screenshot from the ArcGIS REST Services directory, which is really a very simple HTML view designed for developers like yourselves to very quickly get an overview of what's available on a certain endpoint, in this case a map service, as well as both the resources as well as the operations themselves, the things that allow you to interact with the service. So at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see things like export map, identify, query domains, and so forth. Those are all operations, and they correspond to a specific endpoint. For all of these operations, you can go to the ArcGIS developers website and find the REST API documentation that explains exactly how to interact with these operations. What are the input parameters? What are the potential values? What are the outputs you can expect? And so on and so forth. Very, very powerful if you need that fine-grained level of access to an individual service and its REST API. Finally, we've got the administrative REST APIs. This goes back to those individual components that make up ArcGIS Enterprise. The primary components in this case are Portal for ArcGIS and ArcGIS Server, each of which has a REST admin API. The Portal Administrative API is very inventively called / or found at / portal admin. Each of these administrative APIs are for both configuring the system as well as troubleshooting. You can access logs using these APIs, and monitoring. Beyond the logs, you can find things like usage metrics and other types of reporting. So the administrative APIs are really important if you want to build things like DevOps, monitoring tools, or other types of DevOps scripting for checking to see what services are running, manipulating existing services, and other things of that nature. Now, if you've heard of the new ArcGIS Enterprise on Kubernetes option, it does have a new and separate administrative API because it's a new and different option. So that behaves in a very different way. So thus it has a distinct API for managing it that's different from the API that is otherwise found on Windows and Linux. All right, that was a very quick overview of the different REST APIs that are available within ArcGIS Enterprise. Next, I'll turn it over to Jill again, who will talk about the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK, which has a number of different options, including options for how to actually extend or modify the existing REST APIs, some of which I just mentioned. Jill?
Thanks, Philip, for that overview of the ArcGIS REST APIs. And now that we've covered how those REST APIs work, we're going to be getting into ArcGIS Enterprise SDK. Because sometimes the REST API doesn't do everything you want it to, and you need more options, or maybe you just want to tweak it just a little bit to have it work a little differently. So what is the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK? The Enterprise SDK allows for developers to extend the functionality of map and image services published from ArcGIS Enterprise, or even ArcGIS Server from ArcGIS Pro. When we're talking about map services here, we're also including added-on capabilities. So if you enable the feature access capability on your map service, you could use Enterprise SDK to extend the functionality of your feature service. This extensibility isn't just limited to map services exclusively. There are two different types of extensions you can create with the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK. The first one is Server Object Extensions, or SOEs. And the second is Server Object Interceptors, or SOIs. And while these two go hand in hand, they are very different. We'll be going over those differences in detail in a moment. Before we do, though, know that these extensions can be written using either .NET, C# or VB, or Java. Our documentation, samples, and tools provide information for both .NET and Java. So it's up to you to choose which one you want to target when creating your own SOEs and SOIs. Now, once your SOE or SOI is created, it can be deployed and enabled directly through ArcGIS Server Manager. The Enterprise SDK is designed to be complementary to the ArcObjects SDK, the SDK used to extend the functionality of map and image services published through ArcMap. The ArcGIS Enterprise and ArcObjects SDKs can even coexist on one machine. But it should be noted that while these two SDKs are very similar, the ArcObjects SDK and the Enterprise SDK have very distinct and different APIs. They cannot be used interchangeably with one another. First, let's discuss SOEs in a bit more detail. SOEs allow for developers to expose new operations in ArcGIS Server. These new operations are exposed through the ArcGIS Server REST API. And because SOEs introduce new operations in the REST API, they need to be used with custom applications, such as the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, which Phil will be covering more in a moment. Now, SOEs are only for map services. They can't be created for image services. SOEs can be written for a specific map service or for multiple map services. So you can create one for all of your organization's map services, or just one if there's a specific need. Instead of just going on about what SOEs are, let's take a look at an example regarding election night. Let's say that state officials have a web mapping application. In this application, they want their users to click on any county in order to see the % of votes for each candidate. This is an application they can use throughout the night of the election, meaning the data will be updated as more and more results are counted. So how does one even go about doing this, though? Well, you could use a standard query through the REST API. The map service being updated, though, only returns the county name and the number of votes for each of the two candidates, candidate A and candidate B. You can see this on the left table. Now, there aren't any fields regarding a percentage, and even if there were, field calculations would have to be performed. Now, this is something that the client could do, but at what cost? This same query could be done with an SOE. Instead of having field calculations calculated after that query is made, this can all be done through the map service. That SOE can be created to specifically calculate the percentages before returning the results to the client that made the request. You can see this on the table on the right. Here, we will dynamically be able to know what percentage of votes candidates A and B have, which is a lot more helpful than just the raw numbers we'd see with just a standard query that does not have the SOE. Now that we know a little bit about SOEs, let's talk about SOIs. SOIs allow developers to modify the behavior of existing operations in ArcGIS Server through pre- or post-processing of requests. It really allows for you to intercept requests and responses for built-in operations of a service. And because this is using a built-in operation already in the REST API, this can be invoked through any client application, out of the box or custom, Esri or otherwise. SOIs can integrate custom business logic into existing service functions, such as security control, fine-grained user access control, or auditing requirements that are not fulfilled by the default map service. For example, log messages can be created in the ArcGIS server logs with detailed information about the incoming request to the server, including input request parameters and user identities. SOIs can be written for map or image services. And similar to SOEs, an SOI can be created for a specific service or for multiple services. Now that we're all a bit more familiar with what an SOI is, let's take a look at an example. In this example, let's talk about a utility company. This company wants to superimpose a custom watermark on map images exported by the map services. This will ensure proper branding when their map services are displayed or printed by their end users. You could have a client add the watermark for you, but that's a lot of work since you have multiple applications consuming this one map service. This sounds like a good opportunity to create an SOI. Map images are exported through the export operation at the REST endpoint. With this SOI, the export request will be sent by the client and received by ArcGIS Server. The image will be exported by ArcGIS Server, and everything up until this point has been standard. What's new here is that the SOI will add the watermark to the image. This is the post-processing I had referred to earlier. The exported image with the watermark is then sent back to the client. Having this SOI ensures that the watermark will be on all map images exported, regardless of the client making the request. Next, we're going to move a bit beyond Enterprise SDK and talk about webhooks, which were introduced with ArcGIS Enterprise 10.7. Webhooks are part of an automatic notification system. They're the first step. A webhook can exist in your ArcGIS Enterprise portal as an endpoint, and it's set to listen for a specific event, such as a user getting added to the Enterprise portal or an item getting updated. So that action occurs. That webhook will post a JSON payload to the endpoint within the Enterprise portal every time that event happens. That JSON contains a description of the event. Next, your third-party platform of choice kicks in. This can be If This Then That, Integromat, Microsoft Power Automate, Zapier, you name it. Once that platform kicks in, though, that's the next step in the action chain. That can be an email notification to your inbox, or a post in Slack. Hey, you could have Alexa make an announcement during dinner. You do you. These are powerful systems that automate administrative workflows. You can monitor everything from a distance instead of having to keep a close eye on everything happening within your enterprise portal. Throughout our releases, there have been new webhooks added for what actions can trigger these notifications. There are options for groups, items, users, roles, and more. Be sure to take a look at this for yourself to see what all you can do with webhooks in ArcGIS Enterprise. I will now pass it on to Philip, who will wrap things out for us by covering higher-level APIs.
Thank you again, Jill. So now that we've talked about the REST APIs directly, as well as some of the options for how to extend the REST APIs, as well as how to modify the behavior of the REST API. Let's talk about some of the higher level options for working with these underlying pieces of functionality. We don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel. For the most part, you'll be using something higher level based on maybe JavaScript, .NET, Qt, Java, Python, you name it. There really is a wealth of APIs within the Esri ecosystem. And for the most part, we don't expect developers to have to interact directly with the REST API at all, or at least not very often. When you're creating web applications, the premier API that we would suggest looking at is, of course, the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. This is really the full-fledged option for building modern web applications against ArcGIS Enterprise, as well as ArcGIS Online. But there's also multiple non-Esri options, both commercial and open source options. Some popular open source choices are things like Leaflet, Open Layers, and Mapbox.gl.js, all three of which have bindings that allow you to use ArcGIS-based map services and feature services. If you're interested in learning more about these higher level APIs, there's a number of deep dives that I will reference here later on. But first, let's take a look at the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. It's really that full-featured modern JavaScript and HTML5 API that exposes the full set, the full breadth of capabilities from both ArcGIS Enterprise and ArcGIS Online. There's widgets, there's existing components that already know how to talk to things that visualize your maps and 3D scenes, that perform analysis, both using server-side functionality combined with a lot of really, really powerful client-side functionality. The ArcGIS API for JavaScript knows how to take advantage of modern browsers, so you can actually do a lot of things directly within the client without having to do a round trip to the server. The ArcGIS API for JavaScript is the API that we ourselves use to build all of Esri's web applications, all of the modern apps that you see demonstrated and often will be using yourself. That's things like the modern ArcGIS dashboards, the new ArcGIS story maps, ArcGIS workforce, experience builder, and much, much more. These are all built using the JavaScript API from Esri. It's worth noting that there's two major versions of the JavaScript API in common use. What we know as the 3x API, version 3 dot something, as well as the 4x API, 4 dot something. If you're starting new development, you should absolutely be starting with the 4x lineage. At the time of this presentation, the latest version of the ArcGIS API for JavaScript was 4.18. I suspect by the time that many of you watch this video on demand after the conference, there will be a 4.19, maybe even a 4.20. So stay on top of the latest releases. There's always some great new functionality as well as bug fixes in there. But the 4x API is really where you want to be at for new development. If you're creating native applications, so that's applications for modern mobile devices, whether it's an iPhone, iPad, or an Android device, as well as desktop devices, such as laptops and actual desktop PCs. The API of choice is part of the ArcGIS Runtime SDK family of products. And there's really a runtime flavor for pretty much any type of device out there. There's bindings for Android, iOS, Java, .NET, and Qt. So no matter if you're running on a mobile device based on Android and iOS, or any kind of embedded device, laptop, desktop, whether it's on Windows, Linux, or Mac, you can find your favorite binding of choice and use pretty much any language that you want. C++, C#, again Java, as well as things like Objective-C and Swift on the iOS platforms. This is an amazingly powerful set of SDKs and APIs, and I really encourage you to take a look at them if you're looking at creating native applications. You can create very, very powerful applications that both consume the server-side functionality from ArcGIS Enterprise, as well as really, really rich local functionality on the device itself, taking full advantage of the fact that you might be running on a powerful desktop PC or a low-powered mobile device. You can really customize everything to your heart's content. If you're looking at scripting options, the ArcGIS API for Python is an obvious choice. This is a really nice Pythonic wrapper for the REST API. There's both some very thin wrappers that just make it convenient to make calls to backend server-side functionality, as well as some very nice higher level and powerful wrappers that interact with other Python libraries. Pandas is a great example, and there's also things like matplotlib and other very, very common Python libraries out there that this thing integrates with. So we see a lot of different use of the Python API, but I would say that they fall into a couple of different high-level buckets. There's the DevOps and automation workflows where you're creating scripts or other smaller applications that are part of infrastructure and data management. That's a very common use of the ArcGIS API for Python that requires some development skills, but may often be done by someone who doesn't necessarily identify as a programmer or developer. The other use of the Python API is by data scientists and analysts who are doing really powerful analytics. The ArcGIS API for Python is a really nice way of combining ArcGIS analytical capabilities with a wealth of additional other non-Esri options. And then finally, there's use of ArcGIS API for Python inside of notebooks. This is often done by that data scientist type workflow, but certainly also for any kind of prototyping or simply ad hoc scripting and management. There's a lot of bulk data management and user group and item update workflows that are very, very nicely done inside of a notebook so that you don't have to necessarily write a script running it on a server or anything like that. You can simply run it directly on the system itself. If you're interested in learning more about these different APIs, I would suggest going to the ArcGIS developers website, very conveniently named developers.arcgis.com. Here on the slide, you can find some links to the REST API documentation, the ArcGIS API for JavaScript documentation, and the ArcGIS runtime documentation. Especially those higher level APIs have some really great tutorials and live samples that you can exercise there without having to install anything or do anything to set up your own test environments. You can get a feel for how the APIs work really quickly just through your browser itself. For the ArcGIS runtime, you can download that and also work with the various samples on your machine directly. Then finally, in this session, we've talked a lot about the various things at a high level, but if you want to get into the various APIs and options here in more depth, there's a wealth of options out there, both during the Developer Summit itself, but also from previous conferences. So here on this slide, we've got some links out to additional sessions from the Developer Summit in 2020, as well as to the user conference in 2020. If you can go and take a look at these videos right now. Depending on when you're watching this presentation, if you're watching it live, you can also find many of these sessions during the Dev Summit in 2021 and potentially find some of them on YouTube after the fact if you're watching this later on. I really highly recommend watching one of these introductory videos based on who you are and what you typically do. If you're a web developer, for example, watch that JavaScript session. If you dabble in or work as an IT architect or a system administrator, or even simply if you're a developer who wants to know more about how the underlying infrastructure and software is set up, check out the Architecting Your Deployment session. And then there's the best practices for layers and service types. I really recommend this for any developer as well as the GIS analysts who work with developers. Choosing the right type of service and using them in the appropriate fashion is really important to both get the right functionality but also get the best performance. There's multiple different ways of accomplishing the same things, but they're not necessarily always equal. There's pros and cons to each of them, and this session gets into a lot of that detail. Then finally, the runtime and the Python sessions. If you're a native app developer or you're a DevOps programmer, take a look at these and you'll get a much better feel for the various APIs. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that this was a valuable introduction and overview of ArcGIS Enterprise and the many different ways that you can interact with ArcGIS Enterprise as a developer. None of you will walk away from the session being an expert, but I hope we gave you enough information to understand the different options out there, as well as the pointers to those additional sessions where you can really dig into the technology that's appropriate for you and your workflows.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into our session. And also thank you for bearing with us with any of our earlier technical difficulties that we faced. I'm here with Philip and Jill, and we are here to answer your questions. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that we will have a recording of this session available afterwards. And if you'd like access to the slides, they're also available at the bottom of this page that you're on. And with that said, I'd like to start the Q&A portion. So the first question we have is from Anonymous. It says, is there a plan to implement this SOE and SOI functionality on feature services so that we can validate the data without using attribute rules or other validation rules separately? Jill, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, definitely. So actually, SOEs and SOIs are already available for feature services. I know in the presentation I mentioned map services, and that's because features access is just a capability enabled on map services. So you can definitely do this already. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to stop by the showcase at the Ask the Experts part, and we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail about that and actually talk about the specifics. But yeah, that functionality is already there.
Great, thanks, Jill. So the next question is, what version of Enterprise will have SOEs and SOIs? Philip, would you like to take that one?
Sure, thank you, Thomas. So SOEs have been supported for a very long time. I was actually trying to look up exactly how long, but at least back to the 9.3 days of ArcGIS Server. So odds are very good that almost no matter what version you're running today, SOEs are there. SOIs haven't been around for quite as long, but they have been there since ArcGIS Server 10.3.1. So also there, odds are good that if you're on a current version, you've already got SOI support. So you're free to go and make use of it today.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Mike, and it says, how does direct connect, i.e. to SDE geodatabases hosted in, say, Oracle, relate to ArcGIS Enterprise? Philip, would you like to answer that one as well?
Sure. So when you're doing direct connect, you've got a client that is connecting directly to your enterprise geodatabase. And traditionally, that client was probably ArcMap, where you were just connecting directly from your desktop GIS application to an enterprise geodatabase. And that's still a very valid workflow. You can do that. And ArcGIS Pro also does direct connect to an enterprise geodatabase. When you publish a web service to ArcGIS Enterprise, what you're then also doing is essentially using ArcGIS Enterprise, or specifically ArcGIS Server, as that client that is connecting to your enterprise geodatabase. So as part of publishing it, you're teaching the server how to connect to that EGDB, and then exposing your feature classes, whatever the data sets are, through map services, feature services, and the different things that we were talking about.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Philip. So this question is shot up the charts with upvotes, with 2 upvotes. Does the Python API have the ability to integrate webhooks? Philip, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure, I'm on a roll. So webhooks work by essentially raising events, and those events get fired off as essentially a ping to an HTTPS endpoint that you define when you register your webhook. So you're saying, whenever something occurs on the server, please send me a notification at this HTTPS endpoint. So you don't generally define your HTTPS endpoints using the Python API, or even raise the events using the Python API. You can use a lot of different frameworks to integrate with webhooks, so you don't have to write your own web service essentially for receiving those events. Although you can certainly also do that if you want to, but the Python API isn't really a part of that conversation.
Great, thanks, Philip. Moving down to another question. For the map service, by default, the query option is not enabled. Even then, is there any way that we can run queries on map services? Jill, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
No
So
problem.
when publishing a map service or sharing a map image layer, you should be able to have query enabled by default on that service. And even if that's not showing up, that means that that operation was disabled when the service was shared, or it's been disabled later on, anything like that. But really, that query operation is crucial for being able to query that service. So that operation needs to be exposed at that REST endpoint and the REST API that Philip was talking about in order to be able to query it. So if you're an administrator, you can be able to enable that, and that should be able to take care of that and get that operation exposed for you.
Awesome, thanks, Jill. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to shoot through a couple of other questions. One more for you, Jill. Services published to ArcGIS Online also have REST endpoints. Is that correct?
Yeah, so ArcGIS Online has a REST endpoint, very similar to what you see in ArcGIS Enterprise. The client will be able to interact with it exactly the same. There's those operations that are available there, and that client can make those requests to the server, regardless if that server is in Enterprise or online.
Awesome, thank you. So I know we don't have much more time left, and we do have a few more questions. For a lot of these questions, I really do recommend that you take a look at the Ask Our Experts area. There's one question about the ArcGIS API for Python. We have a Python section there, which can really help you. And we have another question on network analyst solutions. And I recommend going over to the ArcGIS Enterprise section in the Ask the Experts area to ask that question. And on that note, I think we are wrapping up the Q&A here. So I think that's pretty much it. Are there any other questions that either Jill or Philip would like to ask that are in our question slot?
Well, I can speak a little bit to that NA question before we continue the conversation in the Ask the Experts area.
Sure.
So today, if you're writing an SOE or an SOI or some other kind of Arc objects-based customization using ArcMap, or rather against services that were published from ArcMap, you will be using the ArcObjects SDK. Several releases back, we made the new ArcGIS Enterprise SDK available. And that's the SDK that exposes an API surface that's very similar to the ArcObjects SDK, although not identical. So when you're migrating a larger customization like what's being described here, you will want to take a look at the API from the ArcGIS Enterprise SDK. And something that our Enterprise SDK team would love to talk to you about is if there's any classes or interfaces that are not exposed that you were using in the ArcObjects SDK. That's one of the major differences, is that the API surface is not identical, and there's a lot fewer things in the Enterprise SDK because we try to really focus it for use on a server side. So please come over to the Ask the Experts area, and we can continue that conversation and see what we can do to help.
Okay, great. Thank you, Philip. So now we've got to run over to another session. So I'd just like to thank everybody here for attending the session. Once again, thank you for bearing with us through all these technical difficulties. I know there's some questions on the recording, and we will have a recording available later. I am not sure exactly when, but please stay tuned on that. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for attending the session, and I will see you later.